Well, the Arab Spring is quite a dramatic development. It's, I think, of historic importance. The world for some years has been moving towards greater diversity and diffusion of power. So by now, if you go back to say 1970, the economic system, the global economic system, was what's called tripolar. North America, U.S. based, Europe, mainly Germany based, and Asia, which at that time was Japan based. Since then, at that time, East Asia was already the most dynamic industrial region of the world. Later, even more so, as South Korea moved from being like a poor African country to a modern industrial society. China has exploded, India's developed, and you have still a kind of a tripolar world economically, but much more diverse. And other countries have come along and are moving towards a more independent role in the world. The one region of the world that hasn't undergone these changes is what's sometimes called MENA, the Middle East, North Africa. And starting this year, that's changing. And for the first time, it's undergoing the same process towards internal overthrow of rigid, harsh autocracies, dictators, moving towards some degree of independence, development. Maybe integration will come later, but it's sporadic. At the two main countries, where two countries of something which are most advanced in this respect are Tunisia and Egypt, and not by accident, those are the two countries that have had a long tradition of militant labor activism. In Egypt goes back a long time. It's usually been crushed by the dictatorship, but there have been some real victories. Actually, the April 6th movement in Egypt is named that because the activists who organized the January 25th demonstrations, which then extended radically, they were also active in the April 6th, 2008 labor initiatives, which had planned to have major labor actions at big industrial plants, Mahala Industrial Complex and elsewhere. Well, that was crushed by the dictatorship, but the memory remained. It's revitalized. Tunisia just had an election. In Egypt, the military is trying very hard to maintain power, but things are changing. There have been some victories. Press is quite free. Labor is organizing freely. A lot of interactions that possible that weren't under the dictatorship. It's other countries. It's more difficult. Syria, it's very brutal repression. Basically, a civil war by now. In the Gulf, things have been kept. A lid has been kept on Bahrain pretty brutally. But things are changing, and it's a significant change in the world. Actually, this is related to other economic changes. So, for example, by now I suppose most Middle East oil flows east, not west. That's a change. And the world is simply becoming a more diverse, complex, and I think healthy place. And it's time for the MENA countries to become involved in this, as is being done. And in there and in other places, young people have been right at the heart of it. The Occupy movements, which are a pretty dramatic development. They're the first major reaction to a real reversal in the course of Western economic history for centuries. I mean, for centuries, most of the West, let's take the United States, for several centuries, the United States has been on a course of growth and development. There are ups and downs, and it didn't happen in very attractive ways, but it's been a pretty steady tendency. That actually reversed in the 1970s. Since then, there's been a kind of de-development. The economy's shifted radically towards financial manipulations, which don't really contribute to the economy. They may harm it. And offshoring of production, so production continues, but somewhere else. And for the majority of the population, that's meant relative stagnation, even decline, spectacular wealth in a tiny sector, which makes the United States come to look a little bit like a third world society structurally. But and this is the first major reaction to it. So these are serious changes all over the world, and MENA has been an inspiration. The Occupy movements here, for example, were sparked by what was happening mainly in Egypt. In fact, one of the dramatic moments early this year was when Kamal Abbas in Egypt delivered, I think it was February or March, delivered a message of solidarity to workers in Wisconsin, where the governor was trying to carry out a program that would essentially eliminate the last remaining unions. And there were big demonstrations and protests, and it was, his message said, "We, the workers of Egypt, support you, the workers of Wisconsin, in our common struggle." Well, that's significant. There have been lots of popular movements over American history, and they're all different, but this one's quite different from others. For one thing, it's unprecedented because, first of all, in its tactics, there have been occupations before, but nothing remotely on this scale. Communities are forming, communities of solidarity and interaction. If you've walked through there, you see it, a lot of mutual support. Structures are just springing up, like food, distributing food, distributing food, health services, libraries, a lot of discussions, lively discussions. It's something quite new, and it's now spread all over the country. There's one in Boston, many hundreds of other cities, and spreading now around the world. Last couple of weeks ago, on October 15th, there was kind of a global demonstration, which I think had close to 1,000 cities involved. Took off from Occupy Wall Street, which itself was modeled on Tahrir Square, and it's unprecedented for good reasons. The circumstances are unprecedented. As I mentioned, we're seeing finally a reaction to a reversal in hundreds of years of history. There was a pretty steady trajectory of growth, development, and hopefulness, expectation that what's coming will be better, even in very dark days like the Depression, which I'm old enough to remember. It was objectively much worse than now, but subjectively it was much better. People, after the first couple of years, people had a feeling, even unemployed workers, that things are going to get better. We can do something. We can work together. There's some hope. The mood in the country now, in the last several decades, hasn't been like that. It's been a sense of decline, despair, hopefulness. Our children aren't going to live as well as we can. The so-called American dream is fading. We're losing our houses. We're losing our incomes, our jobs. We're insecure, and in fact, the system was based on insecurity. It's kind of striking that the whole global economy now, a lot of it is breaking into two different classes, not classes in the traditional sense. There was recently an investment brochure put out by Citigroup, huge bank, banking institution, which once again is feeding at the public trough for decades. It crashes and gets bailed out by the public, and it's happening again. Now they came out with a brochure to investors, and they urged investors to invest in what they call their plutonomy index. They say the world is creating a plutonomy, a sector of extreme wealth, concentrated in the United States, lesser extent in England, but you find it in China, in the Gulf states, in fact, even the poorest countries, there's usually a sector of extreme wealth and privilege. So that's the plutonomy, and maybe 15, 20% of the population, and that's where the economic action is. So you should invest there and so on. As for the rest, we set them adrift. In fact, there's a name for them too now. It's sometimes called the precariat, the people who live a precarious existence. It's not modeled on proletariat, but different. And they're all over, and in fact a large part of the American population is now becoming a precariat. And that's conscious. If you go back, say, 15 years, when there was a lot of celebration about the marvels of the economy, it was all fraud, really, just paper mache, wasn't real. But the maestro, the St. Alan, as he was called, Alan Greenspan, who was presiding over this, when he testified, and the economists at the time were wondering, is he the greatest economist of all time, and so on. Right at that time, he was testifying to Congress and explaining to them the marvels of the great economy he was administering. And he said, to a large extent, it's based on what he called growing worker insecurity. If working people are insecure, they don't know if they're going to have a job tomorrow, then they're not going to ask for things. They won't ask for better wages, they won't ask for benefits, they'll be willing to take whatever comes, better working conditions. And that's good for the economy. Well, it's good for the plutonomy. And in fact, that's the way the world is divided. And this, getting back to the Occupy movements, this is a reaction. They call themselves the 99%. It's a little exaggerated, but not much. This is a mass popular reaction, first one, to circumstances that are dangerous and untenable. It's not like living under a dictatorship. It's not Mubarak, but it's living under conditions that are just unacceptable in the richest, most powerful country in the world. And I think that it'll be plenty of barriers ahead, but even if it fails, it'll leave a legacy for something coming next, which failures often do. So like take, say, Egypt, the April 6, 2008 actions failed, but they helped provide a basis for something that is now succeeding. And that's the way progress takes place. So the significant goals of the Occupy movement can't be realized in the short term, but they can change the society enough so that an alternative would develop to the vicious cycle of the past generation, and it'll be a positive cycle which can deal with some of these massive problems and integrate with things happening in the rest of the world. I mean, I think that statement of Kamal Abbas's is symbolic of what could happen. World solidarity, global solidarity of people who don't want to be the precariat and don't want to live in the shadow of highly concentrated wealth. Popular movements can benefit from participation of people who basically share their goals and who are privileged. The people we call intellectuals aren't necessarily any smarter than anyone else. They happen to be privileged. And privilege confers opportunities, and opportunities confer responsibility. So therefore they have a real responsibility not to go and lecture people on what they ought to be doing, but to be taking part, learning, participating, contributing what they can. Often they can contribute a lot in all kinds of ways, skills, background, knowledge, and that's it's always been the task of the activist left, still is.